The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are simply that, opinions. All are presumed innocent until proven otherwise in a court of law. Sensitive topics are discussed. Discretion is advised.
It happens so fast. Chad takes a couple steps and he collapses.
Well, the first thing I knew, popcorn went flying. And then I thought, oh my God, he shot him.
And what was it that you heard the defendant say?
Throw popcorn in my face.
I was never been that scared before in all my life.
And I think I'm saying either no, 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 or whoa, whoa, whoa. Suddenly my head was to the right, so he hit me with something.
I'm looking up at this guy, and he looked like a monster standing there.
Welcome to Victim to Verdict. I'm Ted Rowlands. On a January afternoon in 2014, an argument over a cell phone and a bag of popcorn turned deadly at a movie theater in suburban Tampa, Florida. 71-year-old Curtis Reeves, a retired police captain, and his wife Vivian were there in their seats ready to watch the movie Lone Survivor. Sitting in front of them, 43-year-old Chad Oulson and his wife Nicole. Their 3-year-old daughter Lexi was home with a babysitter. During the previews, Reeves and Oulson started arguing because Oulson had his cell phone on. A few minutes later, after throwing a bag of popcorn at Curtis Reeves, Chad Oulson was dying of a gunshot wound to the chest. The former cop claimed he was acting in self-defense. There is theater surveillance video, but it's very difficult to see. Prosecutors charged Curtis Reeves with second-degree murder. It took 8 years, but in February of 2022, the case went to trial in a dramatic showdown between a passionate prosecutor and two seasoned defense attorneys. The families sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, and Court TV legal correspondent Julia Janae was there for it all, starting with opening statements.
Just inside of the Robert D. Sumner Judicial Center here in Dade City, Florida, the 6 jurors and 4 alternates are going to be hearing those opening statements.
Mr. Rosenwasser?
Members of the jury, what you're going to learn during the course of this trial is that back on January 13th of 2014, Chad and Nicole Oulson decided to spend the day together. They decided on that day that they were going to put Lexi in daycare. And eventually, at some point on January 13th, they decided to go to the Cobb Grove Theater. They were going to see the movie Lone Survivor. Picture this. So in the very back row, you're going to have the defendant. He's sitting in the middle. Directly in front of him is Nicole Oulson. To Nicole Oulson's right is going to be Chad Oulson. Behind Chad Oulson is the defendant's wife, Vivian Reeves.
The scene was intense inside of that courtroom with these parties self-segregating in the gallery. There wasn't a center aisle, but on one side of those rows, those family members and friends of the victim. And on the other side, Vivian Reeves, the wife of the defendant. Scott Rosenwasser told this jury this was murder, not self-defense, and it was all over popcorn.
There are 2 cameras inside of theater number 10 on opposite sides of the theater. They did capture some of the general part of the theater and did capture this shooting. Now here's what you're going to learn. Chad Oulson had his cell phone on. This defendant leans all the way in. The defendant's tone was kind of demanding. Turn your cell phone off. He was looking at Facebook. The evidence will show you, of course, that's no reason to shoot another man. We have to prove that the defendant acted with ill will, hatred, spite, or evil intent. The defendant states Chad Oulson turns around in his seat, and now Chad Oulson says some words to him. Now, in a perfect world, should that have happened? No. The evidence will show you can't shoot someone for that. Chad Oulson stands up and continues, and he looks at the defendant. And during this conversation, while he's standing up, he says, if it's any of your business, and there may be in there, I was texting my daughter. Chad Oulson reached over with his right hand into the lap area of the defendant and grabbed a bag of popcorn. And he grabbed that bag of popcorn and he brought it back and he flicked it at the defendant. At about that very same time, Nicole Oulson, remember, she's sitting in front of the defendant. She's starting to reach over with her left hand while this is happening. And in the process of getting up to say, honey, it's just sit down. So her hand's up. When her hand is up, and while Chad Oulson's hand's coming back from that popcorn toss, this defendant shoots. At the conclusion of this case, we're going to ask you to find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree.
The prosecution laid out their roadmap through those opening statements. The assistant state attorney telling the jury that this was about anger and retaliation from the defendant and not from a cell phone being thrown, which is what the defense was going to contend. Rosenwasser's presence, it filled this courtroom. It was clear from his demeanor that he believed in the guilt of that former officer.
I thought that the prosecution did an outstanding job of laying out exactly what their case was going to be in detail, what we could expect to hear, and why the defensive theories would fail in their opinion.
So the challenge for the defense here is to try to get the jurors to see it from Curtis Reeves' perspective, and that perspective has to be one of a frightened elderly man as opposed to a hothead with a gun in his pocket.
Next, the defense took center stage with their opening statement done by criminal defense attorney Dino Michaels, wearing his signature bow tie, telling a completely different story of self-defense.
I believe Mr. Michaels will begin his opening statement.
The government has to prove what the state of Florida has to prove in this case, beyond a reasonable doubt, that this was not justifiable. You're going to decide if it's reasonable if you were trained like Curtis Reeves. You're going to decide if it's reasonable if you're 71 years old. Let's talk about Mr. Reeves. All right. 27-year police veteran. Served his community for 27 years, the Tampa Police Department. Highly decorated officer. None more decorated in his years there. Throughout his years, he certainly learned how to assess the risk. He certainly knows how to spot danger. And so when he's in that theater, it's no different. He's got problems with his neck, his back, his shoulders, his hands, his hips. And so what does that do to an individual? Makes them more vulnerable. There's a white light coming from the phone, and it's in Curtis Reeves' face. He asks him politely, would you please put the phone away? The answer he gets is, I was texting my daughter, do you mind? He was annoyed. That's what you're gonna hear. That's gonna be a description. Annoyed when Curtis Reeves asked him to put away his phone. What you're gonna see, there was an attack before the popcorn was thrown. It wasn't just one on attack, and it wasn't just popcorn being thrown. You're the jury. You know what your job is. The prosecutor doesn't have to prove homicide here. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was not justifiable use of force.
If they can get jurors who have cared for someone who is in that age group, that juror might give more credence to the idea that, listen, when they get to a certain age, they get scared of everything and they don't act right.
Coming up, the state begins their case against Curtis Reeves with eyewitnesses from inside the theater and their first witness, Chad Oulson's wife, Nicole.
I see his eyes were just glazed over, and I knew at that moment. But I tell him, Chad, in the next scene, need you please hang in there. We need you.
Now, back to the Court TV podcast.
Curtis Reeves, a 71-year-old retired cop, shot and killed 43-year-old Chad Oulson inside a Florida movie theater. The two men were arguing because Oulson was using his cell phone during movie previews. After Oulson threw a bag of popcorn at Reeves, Reeves pulled out a gun and shot Oulson in the chest. 8 years later, Curtis Reeves stood trial for second-degree murder. Would the former cop spend the rest of his life in prison? After opening statements, prosecutors began presenting their case.
You got your next witness?
Yes, Nicole Oulson.
The very first prosecution witness out of the gate is Nicole Oulson, the wife of the victim. She shared a perspective that was unique, not only being the wife of the victim, but also a victim herself. She was poised, she was direct in the way that she delivered, and at times emotional, recalling the death of her husband that happened right next to her.
After you became aware that someone was behind you, we had the previews playing, was your husband, Chad, was his phone out?
Yes.
All right. Was he talking on the phone?
No.
Making a call? All right. Did he have it like you explained in his left hand?
Yes.
What did you see him doing?
Just the light low. He wasn't holding it up or waving it around. It was just kind of lower in his lap.
At some point in time, you heard something from behind you.
Correct.
What was said?
A demand to put the phone away.
How did your husband respond? What words did he say?
He says, "What's your problem?" The movie hasn't even started yet.
Did your husband use any profanity?
No.
Did your husband turn towards the direction where that voice was coming from?
Oh, no.
Based on the tone and the demeanor of the voices that you heard, what were you thinking?
Why is this still going on? The phone was away. This should be over.
As your husband begins to stand, you began to do what with your left hand?
As I'm standing, I reach over just to tap his arm or tap him.
As you are standing up and your arm starts to move over, do you feel a sensation in your hand?
Yes. It felt like my hand was on fire. It felt like my hand was blown off. It happened so fast. Chad takes a couple steps and he collapses. So I hold it together enough to get back to him in front of him where I can look over the aisle at him on the ground. And I see his eyes were just glazed over, and I knew at that moment. But I tell him, "Chad, and next thing, need you, please hang in there. We need you." And then I started to lose it, so I walked back away from the scene.
I think that her authenticity was the shining star. She spoke from a way that only someone who's lived this experience can really come from and present like.
The prosecution brought in a parade of moviegoers to explain to this jury what they saw, heard, and felt in that moment before and after the shooting death of Chad Oulson. They had different perspectives, different vantage points inside of that theater, but bringing this jury inside of that dark space with booming noise all around.
First thing I saw was a light from a cell phone.
And I could see a light.
I believe it was on his lap. He said something along the lines of, "I'm texting my babysitter," or "I'm texting my daughter's babysitter."
Did you ever hear Mr. Oulson threaten Mr. Reeves?
No, I did not hear him say that.
All right. Did you ever hear him drop the...
I did not hear any curse words that day.
Do you remember if there was, I'm not going to say the word, but a word in there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's what you heard.
Yes, sir.
Did you ever see Mr. Reeves with his hand out and Mr. Oulson chest almost on his hand and Mr. Reeves going, "Whoa, whoa, whoa," or "No, no, no"?
No, sir. Did you ever see Mr. Oulson climbing over his chair?
No, I did not.
Did you ever see him throw a punch?
No, I did not.
Did you ever see him throw an object?
No, I did not.
He reached across and grabbed popcorn from Mr. Reeves and flipped it back in his face.
They reached to grab something and then thrown.
Well, the first thing I knew, popcorn went flying, and almost immediately I saw Mr. Reeves' hand come up, and then I thought, oh my God, he shot him.
So popcorn's in the air.
Popcorn's in the air.
What's the next thing that happens?
Flash shot.
And what was it that you heard the defendant say?
Throw popcorn in my face.
When you saw the popcorn fly, what was the next thing you saw?
Immediately after you heard the gunshot and saw the flash.
I seen him flip a popcorn, and within just a second, I seen a muzzle blast and sound of a firearm.
The popcorn didn't have time to come down, and his arm came up.
And at any time did you see Mr. Oulson climbing into the defendant's room?
No, sir.
At any point in time, did you see, other than the popcorn flick, Mr. Oulson throw anything at the defendant?
I did not.
You could tell from the barrage of witnesses that the prosecution had was that whatever happened was very quick, and almost everyone's shocked that it happened. So it's very easy to muddy up the water by saying these people could not have really observed everything that happened because it was way too quick.
Prosecutors made sure to point out to this jury the lack of physical injuries on the body of Curtis Reeves. They highlighted that popcorn all over the ground, and they brought in a detective to play for them the words of this defendant immediately after the shooting once he was interviewed by police.
And I'm leaning back in my chair, so he kept on hollering, and I'm not sure what he said, to be honest with you. That led me to believe he was going to kick my ass. So I'm looking briefly. I know I can't go anywhere. So I'm leaning all the way back in my chair as far as I can to get away from him. And suddenly he's virtually on top of me. My left arm is out in front of me, and I think I'm saying either no, 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 or whoa, 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 one or the other. Suddenly my head was to the right, so he hit me with something.
So prior to the decision being made to arrest Curtis Reeves, you knew exactly what witnesses had been interviewed and what they had said?
Not by name, sir, but I was under the impression when I left that meeting that no witnesses that saw a punch being thrown, no witnesses that saw a cell phone being thrown, and that's when the determination was made to make the arrest.
At this time, the state would rest.
All right, thank you, Mr. Rosenwald, sir.
The prosecution called 15 witnesses before they rested their case in chief, using their testimony to hammer home for this jury that this was a former cop who lost his temper over popcorn rather than a feeble old man, as the defense was going to characterize him, someone who was fearful of a looming figure and reacted in self-defense.
Coming up, the defense case, Curtis Reeves, facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, takes the stand in his own defense.
I'm looking up at this guy, and he looked like a monster standing there. I figured that this was the end of the line for me.
The Court TV podcast will return.
Retired police officer Curtis Reeves went on trial in February of 2022 for killing 43-year-old Chad Oulson inside a suburban Tampa, Florida movie theater. Prosecutors told jurors that Reeves lost his temper after Chad Oulson threw a bag of popcorn at him during an argument. Attorneys for Reeves had a much different story to tell about a botched investigation and a fearful old man who acted in self-defense.
Mr. Escobar?
Your Honor, the defense would call Detective Aaron Smith. Detective, you are taught in your profession and how to respond to life-threatening situations, correct?
Yes, sir.
And one of the things you're going to look at is you're going to look at environment, right? You want to know what environment you're in, right?
Yes, sir.
A cell phone on that top row, let's call it row A.
Yes, sir.
And that cell phone was towards the middle of that row, is that correct?
Yes, it was.
But since you didn't know what seat Mr. Reeves was, you really didn't know the significance of that cell phone at that time.
Yes, I knew them to be important, but no, I guess I did not know in relation to where they were seated, where that was.
Nobody even told you that Mr. Reeves had possibly been struck with a phone.
While I was in the crime scene, I don't recall anybody telling me that. If by the end of that day, I don't know for sure when I learned it.
For this defense, this case was not about popcorn, but rather about a cell phone, something they said that was thrown by this victim, and that's what created the defendant's reaction. They also showed that photo of the cell phone laying on the floor of the theater multiple times to this jury and attacked the investigation, one they say was botched by police and the way they handled that scene.
Explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what contamination of witnesses entails.
Witness contamination deals with not wanting witnesses to talk with one another about what happened so that each person that you interview and get information from is giving you their recollection of what happened.
You would agree that it is important to ask the witnesses that you're interviewing whether they have spoken to other witnesses about what those witnesses had seen. So you would agree that's important?
I would agree that is important, yes, sir.
And in fact, not only is it important, you normally do it.
Yes, sir.
But you didn't do it on this investigation.
No, sir.
There is surveillance video inside of this theater, and it's important to the defense. They bring in a huge screen to place right in front of the jury box so they can see up close what was captured. The problem with this video is it's grainy, it's delayed. There are parts that skip. It's really difficult for anyone, even inside of the courtroom, to figure out exactly what's going on without help. The defense had an expert to try and get the jury to understand what they are seeing. Also, to help round out their case, they brought in a use of force expert, Roy Bedard, who testified that this defendant, because of his age, acted reasonably in the wake of this threat.
If there's an individual that you don't know anything about them, how does that factor into this threat assessment?
The evaluation of all of those circumstances under threat are going to make you assume the very worst and to prepare for the very worst. Sometimes that preparation may be running away if you have an outlet. Other times it may be that you're forced to engage because there's nowhere else to go.
Dr. Bedard, do you have an opinion as to whether Curtis Reeves discharged his firearm on January 13th, 2014 in the movie theater in response to Mr. Oulson throwing a popcorn bag at him? Do you have an opinion as to that?
Yes.
And what is your opinion?
That's not why he discharged his firearm.
What I like about use of force experts is they do give the context to a jury who doesn't have that context. In this case, I thought he did a pretty good job. Again, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback. Walk in there and say, look, it's a hyper-stress situation. Even cops who are trained have a difficult time acting properly under times of stress. Certainly, in effect, an old guy who was a former cop would have the same concerns at all. So it's a real double-edged sword, the way I was looking at that testimony being presented.
Before this trial, Vivian Reeves confirmed that in the moment after this shooting, she turned to her husband and asked him why he'd fired, telling him that he can't shoot a gun in a theater with people, and that his response was that he couldn't talk about it with her right then. That didn't come out in her testimony in front of this jury. Rather, she emphasized the fear she felt in the moment during that verbal altercation from Chad Oulson.
It seemed like his whole upper body was leaning towards Curtis.
And when you observed that motion, how did it make you feel in terms of what it looked like to you?
I thought he was coming over, and it just freaked me out. I was terrified. I didn't know what happened, and I couldn't believe it. I was never been that scared before in all my life.
Now, were you scared because of Mr. Oulson coming towards your husband?
That's when it started.
Did you look on the ground and see anything?
I did.
What did you see?
I saw a cell phone and popcorn.
Okay. And where was the cell phone located?
It was between Curtis's feet. It wasn't the picture that I've seen. It wasn't that close. Like if this was the ledge, in the pictures I've seen, it looked pretty close, but it was further back when I saw it.
She was a solid witness for her husband. She came across as someone very credible and also someone who would have been fearful in that moment. You could sense that from her in her testimony. The defense called as their last witness Curtis Reeves, walking to the stand with his cane, one that he didn't have during this shooting incident, but one that a later surgery required him to use. It's a contrast to see him walk up with that cane, but also against his towering figure in front of this jury.
Now, Mr. Reeves, tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what happens at this very moment.
As I sit down, he's still talking loudly, and he's facing away from me. I can pick up a word every now and then, but I don't know what he's actually saying. And a movement caught me off on the right side of my eye, and I turned my head to look at him, and almost immediately he had turned and was on his feet, and I had something between me and the theater screen that I saw just a flash of a reflection off of, and then everything went kind of fuzzy.
Did you believe at that point that you had been hit?
Yes, sir, I did.
At that moment, did it appear that he was coming into your space?
I noticed that he was standing up. He was yelling a lot of profanities. There was threats and who the do you think you are? I was texting my daughter. The word seemed to be his primary vocabulary at that point, because this guy is very volatile and active. He's trying to come over the seats. I'm sitting down in a completely defenseless position. I'm looking up at this guy, and he looked like a monster standing there.
Why at that point were you just focused on him?
He was a threat. He was a threat that was very close to me. And the closer a threat is to you, the less time you have to react to anything that happens. And I've never been encountered by somebody exhibiting that uncontrolled anger or rage. At some point at that time, I had no other choice, and I reached for my pistol.
Now, after reaching from your pistol, do you see some hands coming in your direction?
I'm pretty much zeroed in on him, and I know I made some comments at some point in there as this was happening. It was very quick, in my mind, it was, the event itself was very fast. He was so much above me and so full of rage, I guess you could say, that he was going to strike me with all the strength that he had or he could put together. I figured that this was the end of the line for me. I thought that at the very least I'd be seriously injured, if not killed.
He may not have ever fired his gun before, but I am quite assured, without even knowing his professional record, that he's testified before at length in a number of the cases that, he ultimately handled as an officer. And to the extent that you have that experience, that professional experience with testifying, it helps you come across in a way that can be convincing, come across a little bit more meek, not combative. He knows how to handle himself on cross. He knows how to handle himself on direct.
Did you shoot Mr. Oulson because of popcorn?
I shot Mr. Oulson because I thought he was going to seriously injure me or potentially kill me.
Curtis Reeves called this the scariest moment in his life. This despite being a law enforcement officer for 27 years, dealing with all sorts of conflicts. A statement, something the prosecution jumped all over during cross-examination.
All right, your testimony is that you intentionally shot Chad Oulson, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you kill him out of rage?
No, sir, I did not.
How about blind fury?
No, sir, I killed him out of fear.
You didn't just snap and kill him?
No, sir.
How many times are you saying that Mr. Oulson attacked you?
He either hit me in the face, and I suspect very, very, very strongly, rather than a fist, it was a phone. You saw him grab the popcorn. I was not aware of the popcorn, but I was aware that he was trying to grab a hold of me.
Okay, so
and then he pitched it back. I'm not sure I saw that, but I did see him coming over the seat with his fist.
Okay.
At the instant he got shot.
You remember when you were in the back of that cruiser and you said, as I'm sitting back in here, I'm second-guessing myself?
Oh, yes,
Did he
sir.
even hit me?
Yes, sir. I've second-guessing it for the last 8 years. Anybody that's involved in something like that and they don't second-guess it, it's got to be nuts.
Okay, but what I'm asking you is not if you second-guessed that. You second-guessed the very fact that you were even hit.
I second-guessed every step of that encounter. Yes, sir, I did.
We are still talking about a death over cell phone use and popcorn in a movie theater. There should be a lot of remorse here. I think that it will be, I would be shocked if it was reasonable to respond in the way that he did.
Coming up, both sides deliver closing arguments.
All across the theater, they heard the defendant say, "Throw popcorn in my face." That's why we know this case is truly about a man killing another man over a popcorn toss.
You don't get a punch first and then you get the justifiable right to defend yourself.
Now, back to the Court TV podcast.
As the murder trial for retired police officer Curtis Reeves came to a close, jurors had to decide if the ex-cop was frightened or angry when he shot and killed 43-year-old Chad Oulson inside a movie theater. Before the case went to the jury, both sides had one more chance to plead their cases during closing arguments.
Curtis Reeves was 71 years old when this shooting incident happened inside of the movie theater. He's 79 years old once he faced a jury at trial. It was a packed courtroom in the gallery listening to the final arguments from both sides over whether this was murder or self-defense.
Man killed over popcorn toss. When you think about it, you think that should be on a headline of a newspaper. Big, bold, black letters. Man killed over popcorn toss. Or you're standing in a checkout line in the grocery store, and you look at that. Or you're surfing on the internet, and you see that, and you click it. And you think, well, that's sensationalized. No one could ever think that would take place. Because in this case, we know that's what happened. All across the theater, they heard the defendant say, "Throw popcorn in my face." That's why we know this case is truly about a man killing another man over a popcorn toss. And I submit to you that both versions of the events that the defendant told you are absolutely 100% not credible. And I submit that you know that already. The defendant wants you to believe this. A retired captain from the Tampa Police Department who's been involved in robbery, homicide, fugitives, the Special Weapons and Tactics Team, also known as SWAT. Remember during his testimony what he's saying. Man, it's eye-opening. When I first started, the level of violence and the dangerousness, you wouldn't believe it. Yet that very same person wants you to believe the person that scared them the most is a father and a husband that said, "Leave me alone, I'm texting my daughter." Maybe he threw an in there. You can't kill anyone for a that's for sure. Is it reasonable to believe that that person, Chad Oulson, scared him the most in his entire life in that moment in theater number 10? Now, what did all the witnesses tell you? All of them told you, yeah, it was dark. It was muted, it was dimmed, but we could see. We could see. We could see 5 seats down. We could see 10 seats down. When we get into the theater, we can see. That's the real evidence in this case. And what they saw was the defendant started and ended. What they saw was the defendant kill another man over a popcorn toss. And you know what? When people get older, they do age, and their bodies do change. In fact, the defendant was older, and his body changed. Doesn't mean a single thing. Let's say he was sitting in a theater with 2 broken legs and a rotator cuff injury, and someone threw popcorn on him. Oh, well, now that he's got 2 broken legs, he can shoot and kill somebody. That totally makes sense. You know what? His back's hurting really bad. He's got a herniated disc. Popcorn goes on him. Yep, absolutely. We can kill him. Sure, you get older, you can just kill people. But what's he say? He says that when Chad Oulson stands up and the popcorn falls by the wayside, it's at that time this attack happens that's not seen on video or by anybody in the theater, including his wife. And he says at that time is when he was hit by the phone. But he doesn't really know, because when he looked down, he saw the phone, so he just put 2 and 2 together. But on the stand, he talks about this phone attack happening 8 seconds before. How in the world is that? He changed his story. Self-serving stories don't equal self-defense. Is it reasonable to believe that this defendant, with all his background, training, experience, felt that when that popcorn bag was grabbed from him, he was gonna die? He killed them because of the popcorn, because he said that right after the shooting. Throw popcorn in my face. He knew what happened. It's not just hands coming towards him. He knew what it was. And when you watch the video, you see the popcorn and you see from the hip the shot. That's this case.
He started it and he ended it. Great framing device. And then when he gets to the heart of the matter, you know, you can't claim you're old and shoot somebody. He made that point really well. You know, if somebody had broken legs and was sitting there and somebody throws popcorn on him, you can't shoot him. Somebody has a herniated disc, you can't shoot him. If you're old, you can't shoot him.
I think he did an excellent job of making his case and of dicing up what the defense is expecting to present.
Mr. Escobar?
Thank you, Your Honor. Counsel. You don't judge a person until you have walked a mile in their shoes. It's a very wise old saying, and one that actually is embodied in the laws of self-defense, not only in the state of Florida, but in this country. The Constitution of our great country embodies the right and the law of being able to defend yourself. The law of self-defense requires each and every one of us to stand in the shoes of Curtis Reeves, a 71-year-old man at the time of this incident. Curtis Reeves reasonably believed that the force was necessary to prevent, circle it, prevent. You don't get a punch first and then you get the justifiable right to defend yourself. That's not how it works. The danger facing Curtis Reeves need not have been actual. And not once in his entire 27 years of law enforcement, not once, did Curtis Reeves pull a gun and fire that gun at anyone. For 27 years, he's not a trigger-happy, retired police officer. If we were in seat 9A, what would we be seeing? We'd be seeing those hands coming at you. That's what we would be seeing if we were in seat 9A. Why would Mrs. Oulson have to hold her own husband back? A tragedy took place that day. Mr. Oulson died. A family lost a husband. Child lost a father.
The defense's closing argument went a lot longer and compared to the prosecution's in front of this jury. The defense laser focused on something different, a cell phone lying on the floor of that movie theater. They say that is what was thrown at this defendant, not the popcorn.
Clear in the other row, row A. Chad Oulson, at that very moment. A coincidence? The phone? Where did we find that phone? In between Mr. Reeves' legs, immediately after the shot.
Attention continued to build in the courtroom as we got closer and closer to a verdict watch.
Coming up, the jury gets the case working into the night before coming to a decision.
State of Florida versus Curtis Judson Reeves. Verdict. We, the jury, find as follows.
The Court TV podcast will return.
The jury started deliberating the fate of 78-year-old former police officer Curtis Reeves on February 25th, 2022. It was a Friday evening. The next day, Reeves' daughter, who had attended the trial, was getting married. A not guilty verdict would mean that Reeves would be able to walk his daughter down the aisle. But if the jury came back guilty, it would send him to prison for life. Reeves and his attorney sat in an empty courtroom waiting for a decision, and Court TV was on the air as the drama started to unfold.
This is a rare night, a late night jury deliberation. We are on a verdict watch.
What we've heard from the judge so far is that they will be allowed to deliberate as late as they want. We could go into the midnight hour if these jurors prefer. There is this push, it seems, for them to be allowed to wrap up today if they can.
It's dark, it's quiet, but at any moment, folks, it could happen. That's the way verdicts happen.
The jury deliberates for under 3 hours before returning their verdict in the movie Popcorn murder trial. The verdict marks the culmination of a 10-day trial that included the defendant taking the stand as part of a bitterly fought self-defense case that many considered a long shot.
You can see the jury's been out just over 3 hours. Don't forget about Nicole Oulson, who was there when her husband was shot and killed by Curtis Reeves. She's waited 8 years for this trial to happen. 8 years of waking up without her husband there. 8 years of raising their daughter.
Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, I appreciate your being calm and quiet participation during the last few weeks. So let's manage to do that one more time. No outbursts of any sort, and we'll bring them in. Madam Clerk, would you please publish the verdict?
In the courts of the 6th Judicial Circuit in and for Pasco County, Florida, State of Florida versus Curtis Judson Reeves, count 1, murder in the 2nd degree. Verdict. We, the jury, finds as follows. The defendant is not guilty, so say we all this 25th day of February 2022, juror number 2, foreperson. Count 2, aggravated battery. Verdict. We, the jury, finds as follows. The defendant is not guilty. So say we all this 25th day of February 2022, juror number 2, foreperson.
All right, Mr. Reeves, the jury having returned a verdict of not guilty as to count 1 and count 2, you are free to go.
The Oulson family settled a civil lawsuit over the shooting death of Chad Oulson before this criminal trial went forward. The details of that amount are undisclosed. Curtis Reeves, a free man, and that decision creating a reaction, an emotional one, from these parties. Nicole Oulson quickly left that courtroom without speaking to anyone, clearly devastated by the news. The family of Curtis Reeves hugging each other, embracing 8 years later, getting this decision and clearing his name. Reeves and his attorneys reacted to that jury verdict.
Rick Escobar and Dino Michaels, I first want to ask you, Rick, tell me what Curtis Reeves' first words were to you after hearing this verdict.
You know, after being 8 years, basically in confinement in his home, it was so wonderful. His daughter's getting married tomorrow. He's going to walk his daughter down the aisle. But he's never wavered. He's always believed in the system. You know, as a law enforcement officer for 27 years, he believed in the system. And so, you know, I can tell you that, Curtis has always told us that he wanted to tell his story. And I think this sends a message, and I think it sends a message to the community that, we can't abuse the elderly.
It was a sad day for everybody on both sides. It never should have happened. I never wanted it to happen. I never planned for it. I never even in my wildest dreams ever thought anything like this would ever happen. And like I say, I feel as touching for them as I do for my own family.
I guess as long as the individual just says, hey, I'm in fear, I guess that's enough to convince someone that they're in fear. Even though, Mr. Reeves is not a tiny man, I understand that he may have been a senior citizen at the time, but he was 6'2", 270 pounds, former karate champion, as he indicated on multiple occasions, former SWAT team member and in charge of SWAT. If anyone could have defended themselves, and even forget that, if anyone could have de-escalated a situation and or understood how to remove themselves from that situation, that's this man.
It's been a long 8 years, and I couldn't wait for it to be over with. I'm very proud of my team of lawyers here that did a fantastic job in bringing out the truth, and hopefully you guys will put the truth in the papers for a change.
Curtis Reeves attended his daughter's wedding day after the verdict. Chad Oulson's daughter continues her life without her father, all because of a movie theater fight over a phone and a bag of popcorn.
This podcast is a production of Court TV. Go to CourtTV.com for more content, trials on demand, and to find out how to watch Court TV in your area.